The permission of our Mora Dasra, Rabbi Muskin, and all of the rabbis who were here, welcome to the 9th annual Ariel Avrech Yahrzeit Lecture. The program will proceed as follows. I will give a brief introduction. Our speaker, Joel Pollak, will deliver his presentation, and then we'll have a question and answer period. Dr. Mark Goldenberg will sing the Kel Malei Rachamim, and then I will say the Kaddish, after which you are all invited to a brunch in the social hall. Please switch off your cell phones. We welcome all our friends. Thank you for your support year after year for this memorial lecture series. We are deeply grateful that our daughter Aliza and her husband Ash flew in from New York. Unfortunately, Lida, her husband Eli, and their two daughters Mayan and Liel were unable to attend this year. They send their regrets and regards to all their friends here in Young Israel of Century City. A special thanks to Rebecca Jalali, who is the coordinating manager of the Young Israel of Century City, who year after year makes sure this program is properly run. I'm also grateful that Rebecca keeps me up to date on the latest and best Bollywood musicals from India. As Karen and I look around the shul, we are deeply touched to see so many of you in attendance who knew and loved Arielle. When we memorialize Arielle, we not only remember the past, we imagine a future that might have been. Had he lived, Arielle would be in the prime of his life, turning 31 years old this year. Always sensitive to the needs of others, but immersed in learning Torah, Arielle was pursuing a degree in special education at Johns Hopkins. But he aspired for more and tormented himself at the age of 20, pondering his choice of career, even when in the throes of critical illness. Arielle never doubted that he would survive. He sincerely believed that his biggest challenge was finding his life's path. The physical challenges were incidental compared to the task of learning Torah and spiritual growth. Arielle raised our family to a higher level of kedusha, holiness. He inspired his beloved sisters with his sweet humility and kindness, which guided them in choosing their husbands, men he would embrace as brothers. We feel diminished by Arielle's loss, for he was a beacon illuminating our family with a special light. From the time Arielle was born, we always said, Arielle is special. We will continue to declare it every day, and especially on this day of his memorial lecture. Contrary to all logic, as time passes, our memories of Arielle have become more vivid. The images of every stage of his life are easier to evoke in all nuance and detail. This is a mixed blessing, since it intensifies our longing for his smile, his steadfastness, his intelligence and kindness. Yet the enrichment of his memory strengthens his role in our family as a luminous spirit guiding us in the corporeal world. His goodness, his Torah scholarship, and modest piety are a constant reminder of what we should all strive for in our lives. Indeed, Arielle's absence has been transformed into a deeply felt presence. Those who knew Arielle understood that he was a fine student of Torah. His studies in Gemara were practically all-consuming, but there was another side to Arielle that you might not have glimpsed, and that was Arielle's love and devotion to Eretz Israel, to Israel. Arielle was a fervent religious Zionist, and as he matured, he came to understand that the mainstream media had turned against Israel. Arielle understood that demonizing the Jewish state had become the norm for most American newspapers, with the notable exception of the Wall Street Journal and TV news outlets. This was brought home to Arielle in the most personal manner when, as the handout illustrates, on September 30th, 2000, the New York Times published a front-page picture labeled Palestinian Youth Beaten by Israeli Soldier on the Temple Mount. The photo caused an international outrage. Arielle looked at the picture, in those days we still got the New York Times, and said to me, "Wait, that's Tuvia Grossman from Chicago. We learned together in Ner Yisrael." It was also obvious to anyone who knows the least about Israel that the photo was not taken on the Temple Mount. The amount of dumb in the story is mind-boggling. Indeed, the truth is this. Tuvia Singer was dragged from his car by a frenzied mob of Arabs who beat him bloody and tried to lynch him. The Israeli policeman, whose name is Gidon, bravely rushed in and saved Tuvia's life. The picture shows Tuvia bleeding and Gidon defying the Arab mob bent on murder. The moment that Ariel saw this picture was a transforming moment for him. He understood what many of us have been saying for years, that the mainstream media is on a mission to lynch Israel. Thus, our topic and our speaker. Karen and I are proud that Joel Pollak will deliver this year's Ariel Avrech Memorial Lecture, The Mainstream Media's Betrayal of Israel. Joel grew up in Chicago, where he attended Solomon Schechter Day School and graduated Niles North High School as class valedictorian. He attended Harvard College and then earned his law degree from Harvard Law School. Additionally, Joel has a master's degree in Jewish studies from the University of Cape Town, South Africa, where he was born. Joel is a brilliant and articulate commentator on talk radio, Fox News, and CNN. Currently, he serves as editor-in-chief and in-house counsel to the influential Breitbart.com websites, which act as a corrective to the distortions of the mainstream media and are passionately pro-Israel. I am a regular contributor to Big Hollywood, and Karen writes for Big Government. Joel's wife, Julia, we should note, is a member of the U.S. Navy, where she is in helicopter maintenance. So all my friends here who have brought their helicopters, you can see Julia for some tips. Currently, Joel and his staff are putting together Big Jerusalem, a website devoted to honest reporting about Israel and exposing the mainstream media's pathological demonization of Israel. Ladies and gentlemen, Joel Pollak.
Good morning. It's a great privilege to speak in Ariel's memory, though I wish I had been in the audience instead of at the podium. The original speaker was, I believe, intended to be Andrew Breitbart, who I worked for and for whose websites I still work for. He was the legendary online media pioneer and conservative activist. And every day I go to the office and things are chugging along, they keep going, but the desk on my left-hand side remains empty and will stay empty. I know that Andrew had been looking forward to this opportunity for three reasons. One was the common intellectual bond that he shared with Karen and Robert, and not just about politics, but about culture. Andrew always believed that culture was upstream from politics, as he used to say. And he understood, like Plato, that if you controlled the poets, you controlled the republic, though his answer was not to banish the poets, but to fight for those poets who dared to dissent from the prevailing view. Another reason Andrew was looking forward to this was that Ariel of blessed memory was the kind of person who always inspired a kind of awe in Andrew. Andrew was not an observant Jew, but he was fascinated by those who were, and he was often proudly and playfully very emotive about his own Judaism. More than once, sitting in the office, and it's a giant open space, he would burst into a Hebrew school song, or he'd start chanting his bar mitzvah portion, which happens to be Parshat Bo, if you want to know. And partly this was sort of to tease me, but also to amuse himself. It was an interesting journey for Andrew because he grew up in a Reform and almost customarily liberal Jewish community here in West LA. And although he rejected that political orientation, he never felt distant from his fellow Jews, no matter what their political background. A few months before he passed away, Andrew was interviewed by the Politico, which is a DC-based political newspaper. And at the end of the interview, they asked him a throwaway, amusing question, which is, let your mother know how much she means to you in the form of a haiku. Andrew came up with, Hid Afikomen. It was too hard to find, Mom. You ruined Pesach. The main reason, however, that Andrew had been looking forward to this lecture is that the topic of the lecture, the media's betrayal of Israel, was close to Andrew's heart. When he came to work every day, Andrew had two priorities. The first was to cover the news that the mainstream media had either ignored or was trying to distort. And the second was to stand up for people he felt had been bullied by others, especially if those people actually held views that were quietly shared by the majority of people but were being suppressed by the political class. Israel is a subject today that brings those two priorities together, news and standing up for people who have been bullied. Because the story of Israel is one of extraordinary success, and not just in 1948 and the years that followed, but today. It's difficult to comprehend that as we hear about 8.2% unemployment and all the fiscal troubles of Europe and the world economy, that Israel has enjoyed for the last several years a growing economy, low unemployment, low inflation, a strong currency, and it has accomplished all of that in the shadow of continued terrorism and the growing threat of a nuclear Iran. That is a success story the media doesn't tell. What the media reports instead, when it does report on Israel, is either the fixation on its conflict with its Arab neighbors, particularly the Palestinians, with Israel cast as the powerful aggressor, right or wrong. Lately, the media has also shown increased attention to Israel's internal difficulties, religious disputes, protests for economic equality, which happened last summer and are now, I understand, starting up again, tensions with immigrants, and so on. In so doing, the media will actually invent facts if it can't find the facts to make the case, and these facts are invariably facts that cast Israel as a serial villain. Meanwhile, at the same time, those who stand up for Israel and fight for fairness in the mainstream media are either ignored or they're portrayed as pawns in an old-style Jewish conspiracy to control the media. And that continues despite everything we know about that demonology that dates from the early 20th century and before. It's repeated not just by fringe outlets or blogs on the internet, but it is also at the heart sometimes of mainstream media news coverage, particularly at even the three major networks, which are the very citadels of the mainstream media. I want to take a recent example. A recent edition of CBS News' flagship program, 60 Minutes, featuring a segment entitled Christians of the Holy Land. I don't know how many people saw this or heard of it. Reporter Rob Simon and producer Harry Radliff deliberately set out to smear Israel's treatment of Christians in a way that was not only inaccurate and malicious, but which effectively denied Israel's very sovereignty while affirming several classic anti-Jewish libels. As you watch the segment, and you can find it on the internet at CBS's website, the first clue that something is wrong is that Simon uses the term Holy Land, but does not distinguish between Israel and the Palestinian territories. That's striking when you look at the mainstream media because it's a distinction the media is often very careful to create, lest it seem to legitimize Israel's presence in the West Bank. In this case, blurring the boundary doesn't affirm Israeli or Jewish connections to Judea and Samaria in a religious and historical sense. Rather, blurring the boundary allows CBS to blame Israel for what the Palestinian Muslim majority does to the Palestinian Christian minority. Simon focuses on the dwindling number of Christians in the West Bank, and he places most of the blame on the Israeli occupation, including Israeli security measures such as the security fence, or the wall as he calls it. In essence, his segment is basically the usual Palestinian anti-Israel narrative, but it's told with Christian characters with a clear intent to appeal to a largely Christian audience. His most obvious error, however, is not about Israel, but about Christianity. Early in the segment, a Palestinian Christian minister claims, quote, "The only thing that Palestine was able to exploit so successfully was Christianity. Christianity has on the back a stamp saying, 'Made in Palestine.'" Simon does not bother to point out that Palestine did not exist at the time of early Christianity as a name. It emerged, of course, in Judea and the ancient kingdom of Israel. Palestine was something that occurred subsequently in the historical timeline, but Simon simply accepts the false and overutilized Palestinian propagandist line, where every historical figure prior to 1948, including biblical figures, are recast as Palestinian national heroes. The segment does report Israel's true claims that Christian communities in Israel are growing and thriving, and that Islamic extremism is part of the reason Christians are leaving the West Bank, but it balances those facts out with contrary subjective opinions from Palestinians. And here's where the real subtle art of manipulation happens. Positive information about Israel is told to the viewer by the narrator, but accusations damaging to Israel are shown to the viewer either by Palestinians or by file footage and so on. No Israeli Christians are interviewed or shown on camera, nor are victims of terror attacks, nor Palestinian Christian victims of Islamist persecution. Yet the most serious error is one of omission. CBS basically fails to explain the political difference between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Israel is a democracy that protects religious minorities. The West Bank and Gaza do not. The latter, in fact, of course, is run by Islamist terrorists. That affects what reporters cover because you don't see 60 Minutes reporters going to Gaza to interview Christians, the few that are left, whose churches have been burned, whose bookstores have been attacked, and so on. That also affects what reporters are free to tell, it affects what Palestinians feel free to tell reporters when they come to the West Bank and they know they're under the watchful eye of Palestinian Authority officials. To obscure the nature and fact of Israeli sovereignty, which is so different from reality for Christians in the Palestinian Authority, is in effect to deny the legitimacy of Israel's existence. Because if you deny Israeli democracy, if you deny the political difference between what happens under the Palestinian Authority and what happens in Israel, but blame Israel for all of it, you in effect deny Israeli sovereignty. Towards the end, and this is really where it gets nasty, Simon criticizes and actually brings on the program Israeli Ambassador Michael Oren. And Oren, as usual, is very articulate in defending Israel. But he doesn't bring him on to defend Israel. He brings him on to question him about what he alleges is an effort by Oren to kill the story before it was produced. And what happened was the Israeli embassy got word that this was going on, and they contacted CBS, and Oren called the head of CBS and wanted to know about it and so on. And this is portrayed as an effort to kill the story, to censor it, to stop it from happening. And the claim that Israel was trying to censor this negative report was seized on by anti-Israel critics immediately after CBS broadcast the segment. And it was seen as proof that everything CBS was alleging was true. So CBS portrayed Israel as the persecutor and, in fact, the exterminator of Christians of the Holy Land. That point was reiterated on the 60 Minutes website, where CBS featured a story entitled "The Last Christian Village in the Holy Land." Again, not telling you whether it's in Palestinian Authority area or if it's in Israel. Is it an entirely Christian village? Is it a historically Christian village? Just a headline about a last Christian village, as if all the Christians are being wiped out by the Israeli government. Along the way, it reaffirms the idea that Israel's friends try to control the media for Israel's benefit, and that Israel effectively is not a democracy as you and I understand the United States to be, but ought to be a pariah state. Now that's a particularly egregious example of the portrayal of Israel. But this lecture is entitled "The Betrayal of Israel." So what is the difference between betrayal and portrayal? Well, for there to be a betrayal, there first has to be a sense of trust, something that's broken or violated. And for Jews like myself, who grew up in a very liberal community and came from a liberal political background, at least initially, that betrayal is the realization that the mainstream media is not, after all, on Israel's side, and that, in fact, the mainstream media can say things you know personally to be untrue. And in Ariel's case, and this is really a wonderful handout, and in fact, I'm going to talk about this picture later. And Robert and I have talked about it before, not knowing that it was a very important picture in each other's lives for personal reasons. But in this case, Ariel knew personally this was untrue. The person in the picture was not an Arab who had been beaten by an Israeli policeman, but in fact a Jewish yeshiva student from Chicago who was being rescued after being dragged out of a car and beaten. So it's a shock. It's a shock that things you know both from education and from personal experience are being said that are untrue. I think that realization is a bit more of a shock to people of liberal political persuasion than to conservatives, because liberals are more used to seeing their views reflected in the media, and conservatives are used to being falsely portrayed as racist and greedy and so on and so forth. But the degree of demonization that happened in the last decade or so was shocking to people of all political stripes, Jews and non-Jews, anybody who understood the history of Israel and as well as its contemporary reality. Israel did once enjoy considerably more positive coverage in the mainstream media. That has slowly changed over the last several decades, and the trend toward criticism is not itself new. It dates, I believe, from the early 1970s. I'll get into that a little bit more shortly. But in 1984, when Bob Dylan recorded the controversial song "The Neighborhood Bully," He denied in an interview with Rolling Stone that it was a political defense of Israel, but nevertheless, many of his fans, including some of those who were unhappy about the song, interpreted it that way. It was a defense of Israel, not just against its enemies, but against its critics in the mainstream media, who were calling Israel the bully when in fact Israel was the victim. What is new is the transition from criticism to outright slander. And let's discuss this photograph. The caption of the original photograph in the New York Times read, quote, "An Israeli policeman and a Palestinian on the Temple Mount." In reality, the young man was Tuvia Grossman from Chicago, a yeshiva student, who was dragged out of a taxi cab, and he and his friends were not just beaten, but some were stabbed and very graphically assaulted. And of course, it couldn't have been the Temple Mount, because you can see in the background of the picture there's a gas station. So I'm sure if there were a gas station on the Temple Mount, the authorities at the Al-Aqsa Mosque would have had something to say about it, but there are no gas stations on the Temple Mount. Nevertheless, this was printed and distributed not just in the New York Times, but to Associated Press customers around the world. And as Robert spoke this morning, I actually noticed something about the photograph, despite having looked at it hundreds of times. I've never noticed before. What's amazing, if you look at it, is the photographer is on the wrong side of the victim. The photographer is facing the Israeli soldier together with the mob, the Israeli policeman together with the mob. In other words, the photographer feels, in a sense, that they're going to be protected by both the policeman and the mob. The photographer is standing with the mob, recording what they're doing. We've seen this in many cases before. We've seen it in Iraq, where Reuters cameras mysteriously show up at IED sites, or in Gaza during the Gaza war, where mysteriously there's footage that appears from the terrorist perspective rather than from the other perspective. There is a high degree of embeddedness of stringers with Palestinian combatants and with Al-Qaeda and people on the other side of this struggle. They're not there always as neutral observers. Quite often, and in another story I'll tell you shortly, the stringers are actively cooperating with people who want a particular message to go out to the world. So the fact that the camera is actually on the wrong side of the victim, looking at the Israeli policeman and not from the Israeli perspective or from behind the policeman, where presumably the camera person would have been more safe if there were violence going on, is quite telling. There's another story to this photograph before I continue. Robert and I discussed it a couple weeks ago. We know how important it was to Ariel. We also should know, and many may already know, it was very important to the efforts in the international media, the international pro-Israel community specifically, to push back against the international press. This photograph inspired the launch of a website and an organization called honestreporting.com. I don't know how many people have visited Honest Reporting, but it's very, very good. It's very diligent in countering primarily the British media where it's located, but also other examples of anti-Israel bias in the international press. And they have a special article on their website called "The Photograph That Started It All," and that's the same photograph. So Ariel was definitely tuning into something. It was as important to people around the world as it was important to him, and of course he had a personal connection to it. The sad news is that the photograph of Tuvia Grossman wasn't the worst example of anti-Israel bias in the media from that period. The very worst example, in my view, was the story of Mohammed Al-Dura, the 12-year-old boy who was allegedly killed by the Israel Defense Forces while hiding in his father's arms, being shielded supposedly from Israeli gunfire by his father. The footage of that report was presented on French television by Charles Endelin, who's a dual French-Israeli citizen and who's worked for France too for a number of years, award-winning journalist, and that subsequently went around the world. And when I say it went around the world, it didn't just get seen by people who watched the news. It was promoted by governments in Arab countries. I believe Egypt issued a stamp with the image of Al-Dura on it. There's a monument, I think, in Mauritania somewhere. It became a massive rallying cry. Scholarships were established in Jordan. Buildings were renamed in honor of this boy, and he became the rallying point, not just for pro-Palestinian protest, but for specifically anti-Israel protest. And with the history of the blood libel and how current that blood libel really is in the Arab world, the idea that Jews kill children for ritual or other purposes, that's the vein it tapped into. That's one of the reasons it was so resonant among Arab media consumers, and that's why Egyptian state media liked it so much and so on. This was a blood libel on a global scale, and it remains a very emotive image that some people say may actually be responsible for further deaths because it inspired so many people to take up continued violence against Israeli innocent civilians and Jews around the world. But the event was almost certainly a hoax. It was very likely staged by the camera stringer who Underlin was using, a Gaza-based cameraman. And if you look at the full footage of the tape outside of those few seconds that were shown on television, you begin to notice other things, such as someone who's wounded in one leg, apparently, but ends up hopping up and down on that wounded leg, raising the other leg. Inconsistencies like that, or an ambulance that shows up immediately on the scene after a gunshot wound is sustained. Other things that you see if you look at the footage are that behind the father and the boy, there's a camera tripod just a few yards behind him. The person who could explain this much better than I is the French media activist Philippe Carcenti, who fought for years against the French channel that aired the report. In fact, they sued him for libel when he claimed it was a hoax. He lost, then appealed and won, and then turned around and sued them for libeling him. He basically won this whole series of legal battles over his right to point out the inaccuracies and falsehoods in this media report. But the question remains, how could the journalist, Underlin, an Israeli, an award-winning French journalist, how could he apparently betray the ethic of his profession as well as whatever other sympathies he may have had in his personal background when he admittedly knew that Palestinians had faked other news stories? Now, how do I know he admittedly knew this? When I was at Harvard Law School, Underlin came for a seminar at the Center for European Studies, and a very small seminar, but I went because I knew the story of Al-Dura and his involvement in it, and he didn't know who I was, and he was just talking in general about his experience of being a journalist in the Middle East, and he came out with this amazing revelation. He said, everybody in the Middle East journalism community knows that Yasser Arafat never gave blood on 9/11. There's that famous image of him also on the front page of newspapers worldwide. Because the images of Palestinians dancing in the streets in Ramallah and in Gaza were so damaging, Arafat felt he had to do a kind of PR damage control operation, and he had pictures of himself taken giving blood, donating blood to victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. And Underlin said, well, everybody knows that never happened because Arafat had a phobia of needles. And so he never actually gave blood. The doctor took some lamb's blood or whatever and put it in a bag and sort of agitated the blood, and Arafat lay there on the table. But you never see a needle in it's not his blood. He's not lying at the proper angle or whatever. And I subsequently wrote about this, and it kind of went viral. But Underlin knew that Palestinian media had routinely faked things like this in order to improve the media relations of the Palestinian Authority or to damage Israel's media image. So why would he do this? Why would he betray Israel in this terrible way? On a basic level, this kind of betrayal is a betrayal of what it means to be a journalist. We think that being a journalist means reporting the truth no matter what happens. But increasingly, it seems, journalists are not content to observe and report their observations, but to affect what happens, to push their own ideas and interests by controlling how reality is portrayed and how it's understood by the general public, and especially by people in decision-making positions. That might not be so bad if journalists were open about their bias, or if there were other competing sources of information with different agendas to push. And the problem, as Andrew Breitbart often noted, was that journalists frequently pretended they didn't have a bias, and they would hide what effectively was propaganda under a veneer of objectivity. In addition, the mainstream media is generally conformist in a lot of these issues because they share many of the same political opinions, and therefore there isn't much competition. One of the reasons Fox News is so successful is that it noticed there wasn't much competition in the American domestic media market for information that came from a different political perspective, and so it went in there and has been very successful for that reason. It probably covers less news than the other networks. It has more talk and less news, but it's much more successful because the public it's reaching out to is underserved in terms of its political views by the other networks and the other cable networks. So there isn't much competition, at least until the mid-1990s. And even today, there's still, I would argue, could be more competition. Journalists are very conformist and tend to share the same views. Now, for a long time, the media's agenda, such as it was, happened to align with Israel's agenda. And many will remember a time when Israel was portrayed as the brave David facing off against the Arab world Goliath, when Israel's opponents were known and referred to themselves as Arabs rather than Palestinians, when Israel's humanitarian ideals and motives of self-defense were taken as given, not portrayed as cynical attempts to prevent peace. Nowadays, there's nothing Israel that can do that isn't put down to cynical political motivations. Israel sends a medical team to do earthquake relief in Haiti, and that's put down in parts of the international media as an attempt to win public relations favor with constituencies around the globe or so on. Nothing is seen as pure of heart anymore. To some extent, the media's alignment, which dates roughly from the 1940s to the mid-1960s, the media's alignment with Israel also coincided with a certain alignment of institutions. The United Nations, which we now see as such a hostile place, not just for Israel, but for Jews, was the place where Israeli sovereignty was formally legitimized, and people have very positive memories of that. But all of that has changed, and the media has changed with it. The media's agenda, like the international agenda, is one that expects Israel to compromise, if not capitulate. And it's worth remembering just how intense that narrative was. The word narrative is one Andrew was very attached to, and it really describes the kind of story the media is always telling behind the daily news reports. What's the bigger story? And the bigger story in September 2000 was the collapse of the peace process being Israel's fault and therefore necessitating greater and radical compromises from Israel. That's the story the media was trying to tell, and every event that happened was interpreted in that light, was spun to fit that story. That narrative fell apart in April and May 2002. And if you remember, April 2002 was the Passover bombing in Netanya, which was in many ways one of the worst acts of terror in the entire Second Intifada, not just because of the many people who were killed and wounded, but because of the emotive impact and the deliberate nature of that kind of attack on Passover, as Jews were sitting down to celebrate the Seder and to basically express what was the first, to reenact the first Israeli national holiday, if you look at Israel as going back to the Exodus from Egypt. I mean, it's the starting date of the Jewish calendar, and very emotive for that reason. Although, because Nisan is seen as the first month in the Torah, although we celebrate Rosh Hashanah and Tishrei, and therefore, in a sense, it was a fundamental assault not just on Israel's right to exist, not just on human life, but also on Jews and Judaism. And the response was Operation Defensive Shield by the Sharon government, which was universally panned in the international media. But the Palestinians, having overplayed their hand for several months, made a terrible oversight with Jenin. Jenin happened during Operation Defensive Shield, and Saeb Erekat, the lead Palestinian negotiator, went on CNN and other outlets and said that 500 innocent people had been massacred by the IDF. And I'll never forget the interview that Wolf Blitzer did with Benjamin Ben Eliezer, who was then the defense minister of Israel. And Ben Eliezer said, "We believe there are 54 or 55 casualties." And Wolf Blitzer said, "Really?" He couldn't believe it. He just couldn't believe it. And Ben Eliezer said, "Yes." And in fact, half of them were military casualties from our side. And the others, most of them were combatants and so on. And I'll never forget how incredulous Blitzer was. He just couldn't believe it. And Blitzer is thought of as being, certainly thought of as by Israel's critics, as being a pro-Israel member of the media. So that tells you how far the narrative had come. And then, of course, when the whole thing fell apart a few days later and Israel's numbers were confirmed and Palestinian numbers were completely debunked, the media really kind of ran out of fuel on that narrative. And although the bias continued and continues to this day, in a sense that's when the tide shifted quite a bit. By the way, in other parts of the Arab world, 500 was not the number people believed. People believe in Lebanon that casualties from Jenin were in the tens of thousands. It's completely ludicrous and fantastic, but there you have it. The story that we tell ourselves about this media betrayal is often the following: that Israel was in fact the David in the Middle East until 1967 with the stunning victory in the Six-Day War and the emergence of Israel as a regional power and an occupying power. Today, in relation to its neighbors and to the Palestinians, Israel perhaps really is the Goliath. It's a powerful nation, powerful military, and the media, which favors the underdog in almost any circumstance, has naturally shifted toward the Palestinians and away from Israel. But that story, strictly speaking, is not true. Israel's victory in 1967 won admiration from the media, particularly the American media, which contrasted Israel's very fast victory with the quagmire of Vietnam, which was already turning into something the media here was very interested in pushing. Aside from that independent political agenda, the media, like everyone, likes a winner. It's almost human nature to admire strength and to abhor weakness. And I would date the media reversal to the 1970s, to the 1972 Munich Games, to the Yom Kippur War in 1973, the UN resolutions of Zionism and racism in 74 and 75, and most especially the Iranian Revolution of 1979, which is really, I think, the most important year, the most important event in what's happening in today's Middle East, not just because of Iran's strength, but in the whole subsequent history of terror and Hezbollah and Al-Qaeda and everything that inspired. The oil crisis also helped, as did the emergence of new Western advocates for the Palestinian cause, such as Edward Said, who was very articulate, taught at Ivy League universities, and so on. But the media as a whole really began to turn against Israel when Israel was seen as being weakened, not when Israel was seen as strong. It turned against Israel when Israel was seen to have suffered military setbacks, political setbacks, and economic setbacks. Israel's economy was very weak at that time. The reason that the narrative about the Six-Day War being the turning point is not only wrong but dangerous is that it leads to very dangerous conclusions. Israel was not betrayed by the media because it was strong. It was betrayed because it appeared weak. And those conclusions, by the way, are dangerous not just for Israel but for the United States. I would argue that it's dangerous to believe that when people dislike America, it's because of things we have done, or it's because of our foreign military presence, or it's because of our strength or our response to terrorism, and so on and so forth. The media tends to overreact to weakness when it comes from America and Israel. And that's partly because large portions of the media, especially today, are being fed by people with a particular agenda. Iran, for example, is able now to sponsor films that appear at the Cannes Film Festival. China has a massive state news apparatus that feeds into Google search and the news websites and so forth and enters our information stream. These are state-controlled media outlets with an agenda to push. So the lesson for me, when people ask me how does Israel win this media battle, for me the first rule is you have to win the military battle. You have to win the diplomatic battle. You have to win on the ground before you can win on the air. And that means that Israel and America must remain strong. But how do we avoid that betrayal? We avoid the betrayal by not trusting the mainstream media the way we once did. Put simply, we cannot expect that kind of coverage from the media, and we have to awaken ourselves and each other to the idea that the media does not have our interests at heart. The media has its own interests at heart, which are not always commercial interests, by the way. Sometimes the political outweighs the commercial. We see how many media outlets are failing and yet continue to alienate their readers and viewers with overly politicized coverage of the news. What Andrew would have told you if he was here, and I know he would have wanted to be here, is that today we actually have the means to challenge the dominance of the mainstream media. There are so many other outlets, not just the one I work for, and not just on the conservative side, but there are things like the Huffington Post. There are ways to express opinions that are outside the mainstream, that are not controlled by the gatekeepers of the mainstream media. That doesn't always have a good effect, but it can at least provide people with the means to push back against things that are untrue and unfair. And by the way, Israel is understanding this as well as is learning this. The Israel Defense Forces have a YouTube channel, have a Twitter account, have had one for years, in fact, since the Gaza war, since before Twitter really became a phenomenon in the Arab Spring and so on. And it's a means for people to push back against narratives. It's a very successful means. And I can give many examples if you like. Some of them are political, so perhaps the best left for afterwards. But certainly with regard to Israel and misreporting of facts on the ground as they're happening, Israel has the ability now, and people have the ability to instantly push back. We have the means to challenge that dominance, and therefore we don't have to put our trust in people who ultimately don't have our interests at stake. And that's really Andrew's legacy. That's what I try to do every day. Andrew believed in two things, as I said, in news and in protecting people who are being bullied. And sometimes those things are tough to do at the same time, because sometimes news has to overwhelm everything, and sometimes for Andrew, standing up for people overwhelmed everything else. He really believed in citizen journalism and standing up for people who were being drowned out. And I think that's why Ariel had that Tuvia Grossman photograph pinned to his wall, because it is such an important example of a time when the media failed to do both. Failed to report the news, in fact distorted the news, reported the opposite of the news, and failed to stand up for somebody who was not only being bullied, but who was being beaten within inches of his life. And what Andrew set out to create was an awareness among ordinary people that we essentially are the media today. We have tools to make our own media. We can push back, we can fight for the things we believe in. That's Andrew's legacy, and that's the legacy that Ariel's legacy here today has enabled me to share with you. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
The reaction to the media seems to be more so a reactive rather than a proactive attempt. I know you have to start with the reactive, but how much is being done in the proactive way?
It's a very good question. I think there's some that's being done. I think that the increasing number of Israeli films that we're seeing entered into overseas festivals and things like that, the increased number of Israelis who are blogging, who are getting online, writing in a number of different languages, producing their own videos, just about everyday life in Israel. I think that is quite important, and I think it's had some success. The controversial story this week in the pop music world was that Madonna opened her new tour for her new album with graphic scenes of violence on stage involving guns and so on. Down in paragraph 5 or 6 was the fact that she had opened it in Tel Aviv in Israel. So the fact that it's no longer controversial in a sense for that to happen, where a few years ago we were talking about artists boycotting Israel, I think that shows that some progress has been made. And every time that people are exposed to Israeli culture or to positive images of Israel, it does create something very important for future cases where things might not be so easy. I think it's always very important to remember that the mainstream media picture is not necessarily one that Americans or people around the world are tuning into. One of the things that amazed me, for example, was looking at the statistics in Africa of who favors Israel and who favors the Palestinians when they do, the Pew Center did opinion polls in a variety of countries. And all across Christian Africa, invariably, Israel was favored. And in a couple of Muslim countries, it was pretty close. But especially in Christian Africa, and even in countries with avowedly anti-Israel governments, ordinary people favored Israel if they had to pick a side. And basically, that comes out of the Bible. That comes out of people's reinforcement of the positive image they get of Israel every week when they go to church and so on. And it's a very powerful source of identification for people, which is why if you watch a lot of cable news, you see Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein, who used to be my rabbi actually growing up in Chicago, appealing to Christians to support Israel, to donate money to his cause in Israel of resettling refugees from Russia and from Ethiopia in Israel. So there are other sources of positive reinforcement. But I think the criticism implicit in your question is a valid one, which is that Israel's foreign ministry and Israel's PR operation doesn't seem to be seen or heard from except in these moments of war. And all that one can say, I think, is just that you can never let a day go by without commenting on what's happening in Israel in some way or another. I don't know how many people have seen the online newspaper, the Allgemeiner. Has anyone seen it? It does something very interesting. It's embarked on an experiment the last couple of weeks. Every day it's going to report ordinary attacks against Israelis, which happen every day, but don't get covered in the media. Things like a rock throwing at a town in Judea or something like that. Just ordinary things that happen. A car being attacked, of someone being mugged. It said, let's try to give the kind of ordinary everyday attention to these events that happen to Israelis, that every time they happen to Palestinians, they get mentioned in the New York Times. Let's actually do that experiment. They're actually continuing with that experiment now. That's negative reporting. It's not necessarily positive reporting, but it is at least, I think, an attention to Israel that is more than what is normally seen in the media, and highlights the fact that there's so much the media has invested in portraying Israel negatively that it doesn't even see Israel as a victim when it is a victim every day, much less the positive things that Israel does every day and succeeds with every day.
Joel, since so much of the slander against Israel is connected to the so-called occupation, do you think Israel's been a little too defensive on that subject and they've missed the opportunity to make the case that they have a legitimate claim to Judea and Samaria, even if they might decide one day to give it up for the sake of peace, that they've been too defensive? There's a real legitimate claim to make based on the mandate from the League of Nations, which is really the only legal international document that determines sovereignty on that land today.
I agree with you, and I would go one step further, which is that the claim Israel has to a presence in that area is a religious claim, fundamentally based on the Bible and on Jewish history. And it's amazing that that claim isn't made more often, because everybody else, it seems, is entitled to make religious claims to everything. But Israel has to make its claim in terms of international law. And I agree there's something very positive to be said about making Israel's claims in international law. But I think there really is a lot to be gained from saying that our attachment to that part of Israel or to Jerusalem or whatever it comes from our faith. And in a sense, it's very difficult for someone to challenge that. How do you challenge somebody who's arguing on the basis of faith? Now you might say, well, everybody has a faith, everybody has a different faith, so that becomes irreconcilable. That means Israel can never reconcile these things, therefore maybe this is the kind of conflict which requires outside intervention. I think that you can have both. You don't have to lose sight of the mandate and the other things that give Israel a legitimate legal claim to a presence in those areas, but also combine that with the religious claim and remind people that this is really where it comes from. This is the cradle of Jewish faith, and therefore attacking it and dismissing it is actually delegitimizing not just the state of Israel, but the Jewish faith itself.
Yeah, I want to, my question, some context for that. As a graduate of Niles East, I don't want you to give that I'm getting over 100%. Not to fun, this photo, as Robert said, obviously involves such a colossal amount of dough, to quote him, that it seems very difficult, at least for me, to ascribe to it really mendacious intent. In other words, it's so ridiculous. I mean, a gas station in the background, etc. that I don't see it, if in fact it had been correctly captured, as you would have assumed that it would be, that then the point of view of the photograph would have been absolutely correct. The photographer would have been on the right side of the circumstance. In fact, showing a brave Israeli soldier or policeman in this case rescuing a bloody Jewish boy from a mob. It is hard to say whether the photographer was embedded, with the mob or 400 yards back with a telephoto lens. But when a mistake this great is made, and ascribing to it a mendacity that involves intent, it seems to me there's a disconnect there. And so my question for you is, what would be the motivation for mainstream media? You can argue whether mainstream media, in fact, is on a mission to lynch Israel. But what would be the motivation for mainstream media to actually be on a mendacious mission to destroy Israel, or to be so widely and profoundly against Israel? And does it do us really any good to use photographs like this and a mistake, a colossal error, a dumb mistake, as a basis for an argument that probably can be argued both ways?
I was going to ask a question the same, so can I just throw it in?
Sure.
If you can, in your answer, give us a little bit of the tripwires that this photo went through before it had its headline in the New York Times. It's an AP photo. They have an editor in Jerusalem. They've got a photo editor in New York. Then you've got a New York Times series of editors making decisions. So coming at it from the opposite end of this question, you just described for us Arielle's pinup photo and how it reflects the bigger problem.
Well, let me try to answer it a slightly different way, which is the subsequent history of the photo. because the story of the photograph wasn't simply one of a mistake that was then corrected. The effort it took to get them to correct it was so outrageous that if you go to Honest Reporting and you look at how difficult it was to get the New York Times to actually acknowledge it, eventually they did. But they were heavily invested in that image, as well as in, they don't like to admit getting things wrong, but the image was created to create a sense of outrage. That's the mendacity. It's not always that they have a particular political end game in sight, but the goal is to create a sense of outrage that inspires some kind of action to be taken. And this is only the sort of first and most emotive and personal example, because people knew who this young person was in the picture, but there are many others of the New York Times captioning something incorrectly, or using an incorrect map, or narrating something in completely the opposite way to how it actually happened, day in and day out. The New York Times is not the only one that does this. Fox News once, recently, a few weeks ago, I was watching Special Report, which is their sort of nightly news program, and they were describing a flare-up over construction in Jerusalem. And they used the term settlement to describe this construction in Jerusalem. And it's simply not a settlement. It's not even a settlement the way we understand settlements to be, sort of in the West Bank or what have you. It's a neighborhood in Jerusalem, and yet Fox News used that same framing. I'm not sure it was necessarily mendacious, but when you frame things in that way, you're framing them as a problem. This image was intended, as are other images, to create a sense of outrage, to want action to be taken. And that action at the time was contemplated as obvious U.S. or UN intervention to impose a peace solution on Israel and the Palestinian Authority. That's essentially what was being called for. And that, of course, would have involved dramatic compromises by Israel to Israel's security. In some ways might have been a broader capitulation, certainly to have foreign troops on Israeli soil, which is something that people were talking about at the time. Certainly the UN was discussing things like that. That I think is what the agenda was. In terms of the kind of process you have to go through just to get this caption and get this picture where it was, there are lots of fact-checking layers you have to go through, but we've seen those layers fail, and usually in the wrong direction. In other cases, one's just coming to mind now. During the Lebanon War in 2006, there were photographs that were altered by the photo editors at Reuters. Photographs, for example, of Israeli aircraft over Lebanon, where they added in missiles that hadn't been fired, or photographs of scenes on the ground in populated areas where they would add smoke. And this was caught out by bloggers and people watching on the internet and saying, hey, this pattern of smoke is exactly the same as that pattern of smoke. It doesn't match up. Photo editors at Reuters were manipulating the images in order to make Israel look more aggressive and more destructive than it had actually been in that war. The agenda is the same. Not everyone has an agenda, and I take that point, but to the extent that there is an agenda, it's almost always the same, and it's almost always to create a sense of outrage against Israel that will swing world opinion or domestic American opinion and provoke some kind of action, diplomatic or otherwise. And I think you can look at other examples as well as the subsequent history of this photograph to confirm that.
It was more a comment than a question. But Israel's always been accused of poor hasbara. Hasbara's explanation would mean that they didn't make their case clearly. What we can see so obviously from this kind of thing, there's no attempt to look for the truth. I think there's such a deep anti-Semitism, such a deep anti-Israel sentiment in the world today that I don't think that it's the problem of Israel's hasbara, because people are not looking for the truth. It's really what the intention of these people is, unrelated whatever Israel can say.
I think that's true to some extent, but I think that Israel has learned a lot about how you engage the media, how you engage the public. When Philippe Constantin decided, for example, to challenge this Al-Dura film and say this is not real, this is a setup, and he got sued and so on. When he embarked on that battle, he did so not just against the wishes of Jewish communal institutions who didn't want him to stir the pot, but he also did so initially against the wishes of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which didn't want to help him, didn't want to support anything he was saying because they thought this was going to blow back on them negatively somehow, that if you reopened this controversy, it was going to be bad for Israel. they changed their strategy, and he was actually able to convince certain people in the Israeli Foreign Ministry that what he was saying was not only true, but also worth repeating. And subsequently, I think the Foreign Ministry came around to his point of view. So I think Israel has learned to be much more assertive. It's also learned that the media is a much more competitive and decentralized place than it was 10 or 12 years ago. I think the old model of dealing with these kinds of things was, you call up the president of a news organization or you meet with an ambassador or something like that. Nowadays, you can do that, but you also have a variety of other media that you can use to make your own case. So I think Israel's getting better. I think the appointment of Michael Oren as ambassador to the U.S. at a particularly difficult time was a good move because he's extremely articulate. I think Bibi Netanyahu, whether you're for or against, has been a very effective advocate for Israel in the United States before Congress and in front of the TV cameras and so forth. So Israel's getting better at making its case to the people who need to hear it.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment about Hasbara, which is that the Israeli government is a series of awkward bureaucracies run by a bunch of bureaucrats who want to keep their jobs. So if you expect Israel to do a good job of Hasbara, you can forget it, because Israel's Hasbara is just as effective as America's DMV is. I think it's up to citizen journalists to take care of Hasbara and let Israel fight its wars properly. I do have one question, which is, can you speak to the intersection of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism?
I think the best way to answer the question about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism is twofold. One is to look at the history of both. There is a historic anti-Zionism which is not anti-Semitic, particularly on the left of the Jewish communal spectrum. It's a history that fascinated me at one point, and I studied a lot about it, including when I was in South Africa studying for my degree in Jewish studies. I looked at the history of the anti-Israel left in South Africa, and many of the Jews who opposed Israeli sovereignty in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s had come from parts of Poland and Lithuania where there were strong communist parties, or where they were members of the Bund, or where there were ties that lasted for generations with the Soviet Union. And in fact, at the time, in the late 1930s, there were leftist groups in the South African Jewish community that were endorsing Stalin's solution, which was Birobidzhan, which is this Eastern Siberian place that he tried to create as the alternative to Zionism, sort of Stalinist alternative to Zionism. The Holocaust ended that debate, essentially, and it ended it in Israel as well. There were people in Israel who were Zionists but opposed political Zionism. They opposed Israeli sovereignty. Perhaps they were culturally Zionist or otherwise. That's historically. Essentially, the Holocaust changed a lot of that, and anti-Zionism in the wake of the Holocaust became almost exclusively the province of people who were anti-Semitic as well. And historically, the evolution or the reemergence of anti-Zionism is an intellectual movement, but as a political movement, it's opposed to the Jewish state, it's opposed to the existence of Israel. And if you see the Jewish fate as bound up with the survival of the state of Israel, then opposing the existence of the state of Israel must necessarily be anti-Semitic, in effect, if not necessarily intent. The second way to sort of decode this is just simply at looking at our definition of discrimination for any other group. If you criticize Israel exclusively, or you judge Israel by a standard that's different than the standard you judge every other nation state by, that is discrimination, and that implies prejudice, that implies anti-Semitism. It's not true that every anti-Zionist is anti-Semitic, but certainly anti-Semitism contains anti-Zionism as one of its core ideas today and one of its most important motivations. And I think that the semantic debate over whether one is or one isn't is one that I just kind of lost interest in. After being very interested in it for a while, I lost interest in it because I just think it's not as useful to talk about people's subjective motivations for why they're opposed to Israel. The term anti-Semitism tries to put people's views off limits. And while it could be useful to do that in some cases, I think it's just better to beat people. Let them be anti-Semitic and still defeat their views on Israel anyway. That's how I've approached it. I I don't take people's prejudice as the end of the debate. I often take it as given, and then you go from there and you try to show how they're wrong anyway. Okay. Thank you.
It's really wonderful. Yiskadash Merava Yamad Brachute Yamlich Malchute Ayakani Yakon Ayakol Beit Yisrael Bagalav Man Kariv Amen Ishmer Rabban Mevorach Leolam Omei Olamaya Barak Vishtabach Vibar Vitravan Vitnase Yitadar Vitalevi Talal Shmer Kudish Abrichov Le'elam and Kol Birchata B'Shivata Tishbechata B'Nachmata Damiran B'Yal Mav Yimru Amen Yisrael B'Rabbanan B'Al Talmudehon B'Al Kol Talmudei Talmudehon B'Al Kol Mandaskin B'Al Radar Divatrah David B'Chol Atar V'Atar B'Helon Olchon Shlam Rabba China B'Chista B'Rachamin B'Chayin Arichei B'Znei B'Vichei B'Kamid Kadam Abuhun Digishmaya B'Yimru Amen Ishlam Rab Min Shemaya Chaim Aleinu B'Al Kol Yisrael B'Yimru Amen Yoseh Shalom B'Yimru Amav Huya Yoseh Shalom Amen. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Joel, for wonderful talk. You're all invited to brunch in the social hall.